Good afternoon, Dumelang, Sanbanani, Molweni, Asheng. My name is Lesedi Matlala, and I'm from Chet Education Service. So I'm working as an M&E researcher at an M&E department. So welcome to our live stream, which is about education researchers' response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So today we're launching our theme for a report, which is entitled Governance Structures That Have Enabled Efficient Crisis Management Across 3 Districts. So we're looking for ways to effectively govern the pandemic. To join in our conversation today is Dr. Paterson from Church Education Service. So I will just give a brief introduction of who he is, so that we get to know him before we begin with our discussion. So Dr. Paterson is a research associate for Church Education Services since 2015. Prior to this, he has taught mainly sociology of education and development at various institutions, local and abroad, including University of Western Cape, University of Northwest, University of Cape Town, and University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and Udon Thani University in Thailand abroad. So he has also worked as a full-time researcher and research director at the Human Sciences Research Council South Africa. And he has also worked at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. His current projects at Church Education Services involve research into how trust and accountability relationships between teachers and school management in primary schools impacts on learner performance. Another one is about research about the values that TVET college students bring into the workplace. The last one is about research into labor absorbing economic policies for youth employment in Africa. Dr. Paterson today is going to talk to us about the report entitled Launching the Ways to Effectively Govern the Pandemic. So we're going to look at how governments are positioning and activating public institutions such as school systems in multi-pronged efforts to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is a very thought-provoking subject because it will also help us to understand how government's role in addressing this pandemic, particularly here in South Africa. So this will be useful for policymakers as well as decision makers, teachers, and everyone is a citizen here in South Africa. So, ladies and gentlemen, without wasting time, please join me in welcoming our guest today, Dr. Paterson, to the stream. Dr. Paterson, welcome to the stream.
Thank you very much, Lesedi. It's good to be here.
Thank you. So I shall begin with our conversation. Dr. Paterson, please tell us about your involvement and your role in the research bootcamp.
Well, Lesedi, as you've indicated, I'm based at JET, and I think we came up with a great idea to harness the energies of people out there who are interested in making sense of the COVID pandemic as it was coming into the landscape. And so this was a great opportunity for us. There were 15 researchers who worked together on this topic, and they all split into pairs and focused on particular countries. And this is really important because it's very difficult to get a hold of all of the facets of what's happening in the pandemic. And so to have simultaneous research at the same time of 6 case studies was very useful to bring a lot of information together, and that made it possible for us to do the analysis. So I'd really like to acknowledge that there were 15 researchers who contributed to this work. And of course, my colleague, my co-lead, Raymond Matlala. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paterson. So about this particular theme, what was the main purpose of this topic?
Well, the main purpose really was about trying to understand lockdown, even at that early stage. What we knew was that the COVID-19 virus was going to make a lot of trouble in a lot of environments. And we thought that we should look at governments as a place to start, since governments are the largest and most important actor that is responsible for taking care of citizens. But of course, what we also know is that governments are largely bureaucracies, and they're not really designed specifically to counter something like COVID. Not least of all because it's unusual, but because COVID as a phenomenon moves very, very quickly through its environment. So we had then to look at lockdown, but also what we wanted to understand was, what did lockdown mean in different countries, and how did those countries decide on their lockdown strategy, as it were. So we had to take into consideration that these all of the countries that have put in place lockdown, which is a very large proportion of the total number of countries affected by COVID, and they would differ in terms of their lockdown, instituting lockdown based on the population size, the medical emergency of COVID, the culture of the country, resources, the politics of the country, and so on. So we also were trying to look at ways in which we could perhaps establish what worked and what did not work. And one of the things that we'll talk a bit about later is, for instance, in education, did lockdown work? And what happened to education under lockdown? So these were the key questions that we were addressing.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson. It's a very interesting topic and a very, very interesting theme, given the background that you just gave us. So, could you tell us, perhaps, and give us just a brief overview of how countries or governments around the globe responding to this crisis?
It's very interesting. There is a lot of variety at the local level, but at a high level, there are a lot of similarities. And I think the one thing that we need to remember is, before COVID, there was not enough preparation by countries for what was going to happen. There were perhaps one or two countries that had adequately prepared. So one of the foundation of resisting COVID was not there for many countries. And so this is an important thing to note, because what it meant then was most countries were going into a kind of an emergency. And in dealing with that emergency, of course, they mobilized their medical systems. But many countries' medical systems are not sufficient, and were deemed not sufficient to meet the kinds of stress that COVID sickness and mortality would generate. And this has to do with different countries' access to medical care, and of course, countries with less money to expend on medical care would be unfortunately more vulnerable to COVID in terms of coping. So other than the health system, countries also had other resources at their disposal. You know, a government has resources such as finances to build more medical facilities and so on. So we can see that the COVID attack on societies was actually became very expensive. But it wasn't just about money. It was also about how to how to undertake a lockdown, which is highly antithetical to the concept of democracy and freedom of movement and so on. How did this happen? So what was really important for us to understand was the extent to which there was cooperation between government and the society. Did they see themselves on the same side, working against the common enemy, as it were, which was the COVID virus? And in countries, through the process of the pandemic, we see different levels of cooperation, but then sometimes just compliance, and then sometimes compulsion. Meaning that the state was operating in a more heavy-handed way. So we have to recognize this as one of the facets of how governments have tried to deal with COVID. And of course, if we look at the history of COVID, the very short history of COVID, it's ironic that the first country that faced COVID was China. And of course, China has a particular structure. It has a particular system of governance, which is driven by a one-party state, which has greater control over laws, which has greater control over policy, and also over people's lives, being very hierarchical. So the case of COVID's move into China created a first case study in which this was a state that was probably the only state of its kind, which is hugely powerful, but which could operate in a way that ruthlessly was able to push against COVID. Now, that was not possible. That's not possible. Many people said, well, this won't happen in other countries, and they were correct. But perhaps just to choose the United States, the United States suffered because it wasn't prepared, because it delayed, but it also suffered because it's made of 50 states which have relative independence, and so a national lockdown couldn't work. And so we would need to ask more questions about that lockdown in the United States and why, for instance, that the leadership of Donald Trump, why there wasn't a push for a standardized approach. So in that sense, we have to look at lockdowns as political phenomena now. The lockdown is a new political phenomenon or a political arrangement where the state has different controls in different countries. In China, it was absolute control. But in other countries, we also see that under lockdown, governments in power have been able to use the lockdown conditions to try and improve their standing and their popularity. But because a lockdown is generally not a popular thing, because it hurts a lot of people, governments have had to try and deal with that stress of at first being the mobilizers of and being the strong leaders of mobilizing lockdown, but then later on of being the ones who were not particularly confident about lifting lockdown. So these are the these I think are the broader issues and tensions that came out of lockdown in a general way, without necessarily looking at more specific aspects of lockdown.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paterson, for giving us this detailed overview of how other countries are responding to this pandemic, especially giving us a comparison analysis between the big states such as China and United States of America. So as you have mentioned that most countries, they were not prepared before this COVID-19. So by what means government at their disposal have so far implemented a non-pharmacological strategies to contain this COVID-19 pandemic?
I think that is a major question for us. Because again, the truth is that the majority of countries were not prepared on the medical front, but the majority of countries were inevitably going to have to use lockdown because classically lockdown is seen as creating a space, a time opportunity for governments to do at least two things. The one is that it allows government to slow down the reproduction rate, the infections rising in the country, and the other one is to prepare its medical system. However, those kinds of conditions, those kinds of strategies are subject to available resources, but they're subject to market principles or the markets in the globe. Because what we've seen is governments, even if they necessarily had money to buy necessities like tests, they weren't able to because the global market was restricting their ability to follow a stronger medically driven process of dealing with COVID. But what does that mean for countries that are less developed? It also means that less developed countries will automatically need to move to non-pharmacological methods. And those methods largely are about human behavior because the virus is carried inside of us as human beings. We are the bearers of the virus, and therefore our movements dictate the extent to which the virus can replicate. And so this is, I think, a key issue here, and that is that the non-pharmacological or non-medical, more broadly, um, are actually to some extent more important um, than I'm not saying one could exclude medical um, response to the virus, but I think it's very important to bear in mind the importance of these behaviors. So what we did then we looked at different methods that government have for reducing the ability of the virus to replicate. And essentially, their very basic elements are to restrict travel and transport. So every time I go to work, I can raise my risk of being infected. Transport or travel on a broader level. We need to restrict other institutional arrangements where people are together. So that includes work, and that includes shopping. That basically, I suppose, is household consumption is a driver of the economy, but it also keeps households functional and sustainable. So that is, anytime we go shopping or we engage, then that is an area where we could be infected. And so these aspects, but as well as other recreational activities also had to be controlled. But now the question for us is which of those prohibition on traveling, prohibitions on working, which one was more effective at reducing infections relative to the other? And it's actually very hard to find data or information that can give us an understanding of that. So in a way, we realize it's very, very difficult to work out exactly what a good lockdown strategy is. We can think about a lockdown strategy that is more or less successful. And by that we mean to what extent the lockdown conducted allowed the government to control it to a high degree. But this is not something that has happened in all countries. Just as in South Africa and in less developed countries, other less developed countries, because we've got a country of distinctions between people that are well off and between people who live in poverty. But the key issue here is that for people who lack access to medical resources, the most important thing is how they how they behave. But we know that in large, packed, dense urban areas, such as our townships and such as other informal settlements, it's very difficult to carry out the appropriate behaviors to limit your risk of infection. And another aspect related to that, which has made lockdown very unpopular internationally, is that is that it's also caused deep challenges for people to sustain themselves, especially in African countries where there's a large informal sector labor market. If you are forced to stay at home, you can't provide for the sustainability of your household.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paterson. Having read the report myself, particularly with this question, we can go the whole day trying to share some of those pharmacological strategies that governments are using to contain this COVID-19. So, but coming back to the education sector now, because the research bootcamp itself, it was based the research was based on the education sector, trying to find information that the education sector can utilize in their policy making decisions. So, what is the contribution of schooling system in support of government COVID-19 containment strategy, particularly there?
I think that is quite a complicated question, and on the one hand, it's complicated because of the issue of the extent to which schools play a part in the transmission of the COVID virus. In other previous pandemics or epidemics of other COVID strains and of flu, those in those cases, schools have proven to be a place which propagate the virus. But in the case of COVID-19, it doesn't appear to be the case. So the one issue then is, what role do schools play in terms of the propagation of the virus? It doesn't seem that it's very high in the case of COVID-19, and there is research that has recently been published, a review of the literature, which even points to under the previous SARS outbreak, these schools didn't play a major role. So. And then there's also further a modeling study done in the UK, which suggests also that closing universities and schools doesn't play as large a role in reducing the epidemic as compared to transport, as compared to preventing meetings, closing workplaces, and so on. In fact, there are distinct disadvantages to there's very distinct disadvantages to the issue of closure of schools. For instance, when parents or caregivers stay at home to take care of their children, then they can't work, and so their labor is withdrawn temporarily from the labor force. But this reduces productivity. And in some countries, this has been sufficient to reduce the numbers of nurses that go to the hospitals to help to fight the virus. But there are very serious connotations of closure of schools. In South Africa, for instance, we find that closure of schools restricted children who needed nutrition, school meals. School meals were not really available, or have been available in different provinces. In other spaces, not just in South Africa, the closure of schools can mean that children will not come back, because it's a very important struggle to keep children in school in countries where they might be pulled into child labor and those kinds of activities. So, and then of course there is learning loss of different kinds. Now, we have seen a flowering of online opportunities for learning in schools, but to a greater or lesser degree, depending on the technological saturation of the country. But what we see is that even in the technologically rich countries, that the poorer sections of those communities also suffer disadvantage. So there's a strong argument to not necessarily focusing only on online learning as a means of addressing lockdown. So these are some of the issues, but a further issue has been the question of how young children return to school after lockdown. And in some countries, government, like in New South Wales in Australia, we've seen scientific research being cited directly as a reason for pulling children back to school. But there's a problem with this, because scientific research, you can't cite one piece of science necessarily as an argument for making all of the children to come back to school. And what we see is there are still somewhat contradictory arguments around the infectiousness of learners and the need and the idea that they should be allowed to go back to school. So there is a question of how policy articulates with academic research. But on the other hand, there is also the issue of trust, the trust of parents in the educational administration. Do they really trust the administration that it will take care of their children? So there's the trust issue. And in addition to that, what we see is what we need to take account of is the extent to which the government education system is able to track and to follow up on possible outbreaks. And so these possible outbreaks, unless they are systematically tracked, we can't tell whether they are abnormal or whether they are normally within the expected incidence of COVID infection in children. And so in a country without data, it's very hard to assure parents that their children will be safe if they read in the newspaper that 200 children were infected in KwaBakra in the Eastern Cape. So there are these issues. And a last point around that is, there's an article that I read in the New York Times which said which quoted a parent saying, the statistics look okay, but what happens when it happens to your child? So there's a fundamental protective element to this as well. So the jury is really out on the effectiveness of schools. But even if we allow the schools to stay open during a lockdown, that would need careful coordination and sets of protocols so that the schools don't cause indirectly cause more infections because parents are coming and so on. But the general idea has been just for lockdown to take place, not necessarily as a matter of choice, but just because people knew of no alternative.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson, for sharing very valuable and deep insights about how countries and governments are responding to this crisis, as well as sharing with us the strategies that government are implementing to contain this COVID-19. As long as sharing this a very, very important one, the contribution of the schooling system in support of government COVID-19 containment strategy. These are very, very important points. As I've mentioned, myself having seen the report and having read the report, we can take a week discussing all these issues because they're broader. And thank you very much for trying to summarize them. So, having touched on these major issues, what are the could you please just summarize the key main findings of this particular report?
Well, that's a tough question to respond to, given that there are many different layers. But what I would perhaps like to highlight is that what is really important is for human societies to remain vigilant. And especially societies in developing countries, because as we know, human behavior, our ability to control our environment is very important, especially where we don't have a strong medical systems. We need to also upgrade our screening and testing. In many African countries and in other countries, there are insufficient resources to do enough testing to make confident predictions and observations about where to find hotspots and so on. So I think that's also something that needs to be racked up quite strongly in developing countries. Another thing that comes out quite clearly is that most of the research literature and sociological literature is based in Europe, North America, and Asia. And we don't know enough about the societies in Africa. We don't know how the COVID virus really does interact in African societies. 60% of African people still live are still rural. They live in rural environments. So, and what we also see is that there are differences in infection rates and so on. We need to work strongly to establish what are these differences and why are these differences appearing in African countries. So we, in a way, what this research does highlight, I think, is that there's a lot more to be done, and that we need to develop a literature in Africa about how COVID is working here. So, and in the meantime, though, we've inherited lockdown as the option, but there are other options. But we need to test. We need to test those. We need to find ways of testing those out or taking the best from those examples.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson, for summarizing these key findings. I know it's difficult to summarize all this based on the issues that we have touched, or this report specifically has touched on. And thanks for identifying any other gaps that researchers need to fill in this regard. So perhaps my last question now will be for you to summarize the key recommendations emanating from this report that they are applicable now during the COVID-19 and post-COVID-19.
I think that one of the things that we need to do is we need to look more deeply into the lockdown. So I've spoken about testing and those kinds of things, but I think we need to understand lockdown better. And also we need to work on our ability to design the lockdowns that best meet the needs of the societies where the lockdown is being carried out, and not just do a blanket lockdown. This is especially important in developing countries where lockdowns have shut down the entire informal sector, as I've mentioned, before. So I think that's a really important thing to look forward to. What we also need to realize is that the COVID era will only be finished in terms of infections when there's a vaccine. So it'll probably be some time before we arrive at that point. And it does seem that we need to find a balance in different countries where we can, how can one say, live with the COVID virus in the best way possible for the quality of life, for our own quality of life, and reduction of risk. But until there's a vaccine, there will continue to be risk, and so we'll have to live with it as best we can and as responsibly as we can.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson, for taking your time coming here to share these available insights, especially during these difficult times of COVID-19, where there is a lot of uncertainty about things. Therefore, this report offers to us research-based information that will help the policymakers, as well as researchers and other actors to help with containing this pandemic virus. And thank you very much to the viewers who managed to tune in into this very, very educative, insightful live stream. Any final ways, perhaps, Dr. Peterson, before I close, that you'd like to share with the viewers who are watching this?
Lesedi, I think that we are going into a period in which there's going to be a huge amount more research, and that in a way that in JET we were fortunate to be at the beginning of this wave because we responded early and we began our research during the first lockdowns. So we'll probably see for generations studies of lockdown and of the coronavirus. The main point being that we need to learn from them so that we are not caught out in this way. If I may make one last point, and that is that the corona crisis came very quickly because corona is very fleet of foot. It worries me if I think about corona in relation to global warming, because the global warming crisis is creeping on us all the time. But I feel that we have similar issues. We need to address global warming in a similar way. We need to be more prepared. Otherwise, we might be running in the dark in a way as we are with COVID. Too late.
Dr. Peterson, thank you very much for your time again. The reports is also available at JET websites. It's also available at JET's social media pages. You can check it there to read more about these emanating from this discussion. Dr. Peterson, thank you very much.
Thank you for being here.